Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How is everyone? We would like to welcome you to the first of our speaker series. We are excited to kick it off this evening. I am Frankie Huff, and I am on the speaker series and happy to be here and happy to start our speaker series this evening with Mr. Nicholas Carr. Nick Carr is a compelling writer and speaker whose work focuses on the intersection of technology, business, and culture. He is currently the Richmond Visiting Professor at Williams College in Massachusetts. A former executive editor from Harvard Business Review, he has written a series of best-selling books that have reshaped the understanding of and relationship with technology, including Does IT Matter?, The Glass Cage, the Pulitzer Prize finalist The Shallows. In Nick's 2008 book, The Big Switch, Rewiring the World, From Edison to Google, has been praised as the best book on the rise of cloud computing. In addition to his books, Nick has written for The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, Wired, Nature, MIT Technology Review, among others. In 2015, he received the Neil Postman Award for Career Achievement in Public Intellectual Activity from the Media Ecology Association. Nick is a former member of the Encyclopedia Britannica's editorial board of advisors, was on the steering board for the World Economic Forum's Cloud Computing Project, and was a writer in residence at the University of California at Berkeley's Journalism School. He also maintains the popular blog Rough Type. Please join me in welcoming Nick Carr.
That's on. Thank you, Professor Huff. Got my own mic here, so. And thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. It's a real pleasure to be able to be here at Seminole State and to have this opportunity to share some of my ideas with you. What I'd like to look at in particular this evening is what our smartphones are doing to us, and in particular, how they're influencing the way we think, the way we socialize, the way we perceive things. And I'm sure I know this is a subject, and technology in general is a subject that a lot of people have opinions about, sometimes very strong opinions. You have people on one end of the spectrum who are very enthusiastic about everything technological and are convinced that all the effects are necessarily good and will only get better in the future. And then you have people on the other side of the spectrum who see technology as kind of destroying everything they think is good in society and are very, very worried about how that's going to play out. And then most people, I think, are somewhere in the middle. They certainly know the benefits they get from the internet and smartphones and social media, but they're also worried about our dependency on this technology, our reliance on it to do almost everything these days, and how it is influencing both themselves and the other people around them. If they're parents, then how it's affecting their children in particular is a constant concern. And I have my own opinions as well, but what I'm going to try to do this evening is look at what we can learn from the actual scientific and other research studies that have gone on looking into this question. As is often the case these days with technology, a new technology comes along and it gets adopted very, very quickly. It spreads throughout society. And it's only afterwards that scholars and other researchers begin to do the experiments and other types of studies that give us insight into what it's doing to us. So research tends to lag, same goes for politics and law and pretty much everything else, tends to lag behind technological progress itself, but I do think particularly over the last 5 or 10 years, there have been a lot of studies done, and I think they are beginning to point in particular directions, and I think we can learn a lot from them that may influence how we as individuals, but also as a society, deal with and think about these very powerful technologies in the future. Let me start by talking to you a little bit about how I got interested in this subject in the first place. I know some of the students here are reading some of the works that I did about 10 years ago. I wrote an article for the Atlantic magazine called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And that, the answer is yes. And I expanded that article into a book called "The Shallows" that came out in 2010. And my own story, what inspired these works, and inspired my interest in this, was my own sense of how I was personally changing the more I used the internet and personal computers and other related technologies. I'd always been a big enthusiast about technology, and particularly about computers, ever since the first personal computer was invented. And I'd been a writer on the subject as well, so I was really immersed in the subject. But around 2007, I began to realize that I was having a much harder time paying attention than I used to have, a lot harder time maintaining my focus or my concentration on one thing. And I realized what my mind seemed to want to do is, even when I wasn't at my computer, my mind wanted to behave as if it was at the computer. So I wanted lots of stimulation, the kind of stimulation you get through your phone or through your computer, lots of messages coming at you, lots of links you can click on, Google searches you can do. And I realized I was having a hard time breaking away from that mode of very fast-paced but also very distracted types of thinking. And that made me wonder whether, in fact, technologies that we use every day can have a deep influence on the way our minds work, on the way we think. And I began to look in particular at 2 areas of research. One was to look at what brain scientists could tell us about how our minds adapt to technology. And then the other part of the research was looking back in history to see if there were other examples of major new technologies that came along and that seemed to have a deep effect on the way people think. And as I did the historical research, one thing became clear to me very, very quickly, and that is that among all the many different types of tools and technologies that human beings invent and use, there's one small but very, very important category that I call intellectual technology. And essentially, what I mean by that is that these are the tools we use to think with. So the tools we use to organize information, analyze information, express ourselves, share ideas with others. These are all intellectual technologies. There aren't a whole lot of these in history compared to various other types of technologies. But when you look at them, what you see over and over again is that when a new intellectual technology or tool becomes popular, it does have a tendency to shape the way people think. You begin, and it depends on exactly how popular technology is, but people begin to think in the way that the technology allows them, or at least encourages them to think, and they begin to move away from older or different forms of thinking that the technology doesn't support. And you can see this if you go all the way back to one of the very earliest of these kinds of intellectual technologies, the map. Most of us are so familiar with maps, either in the old physical paper form or on our phones and computers, that we hardly even think of them as tools or technologies anymore. But a map is very much a technology. It was invented by human beings at some point in the far, far distant past. And if you think about what happened, there was a drastic change in the way people thought about space and where they were and where they were going when you introduced the map. Before the map came along, people understood the area they were in, the space they were in, through their senses. They looked at it and heard things. And if they went from one place to another, then they'd have to remember how they got there through all these sensory cues, the woods around them or whatever. As soon as you introduce the map, you get a radically different way to think about space. Instead of your senses telling you what's around you and what's visible, your mind has to think about space in an abstract way. And it turns out, at least from what historians of map making, cartography tell us, this was really a hard thing for people to do initially. And you can kind of understand why. If you've only understood your surroundings through your senses, and somebody gives you this picture of a space that's an abstract image of a map, it's really, really hard to say, how does this relate to what I see around me? So you have to teach your mind how to understand this abstract picture. And that set off, beyond the uses of maps to get around, that set off this change in the way people think. The map helped us begin to think about the hidden patterns that lie behind our sensory perception of the world. So you begin to structure lots of other questions that are all about finding these patterns and then relating them back to our experience. We see something similar happen with the technology of the clock, the mechanical clock. This is something much, much more recent in human history. I think the people think the first mechanical clocks were introduced around the 1400s, so not that long ago, pretty recent. And again, before you had a clock to tell you the time, you understood time through your senses, and you saw it as this kind of natural, cyclical process. You'd follow the sun across the sky, and you kind of measure where you were in the day by that. For longer-term things, you'd watch the seasons pass, trees change, stars change. You introduce the clock, and again, you get this radically different idea of time. Rather than time being this cyclical, natural flow, time is suddenly broken into these particular, precisely measurable little units, seconds, minutes, hours. Things that don't really exist in nature, but that we, thanks to the clock, impose on time. And here, too, you see these big changes in human thinking as soon as you introduce this new tool. People begin to think in a more scientific way, measuring phenomena through time. And it leads to, I think this isn't the only reason, but it leads to an explosion in the scientific method, ways to explore the natural world that require close, tight measurement. So in both of these cases, we see a technology come along that has particular uses, measuring time or figuring out where you are and where you're going to go, but has influence well beyond those practical uses, and begins to change not only how we think, but how we think about thinking. To sum up, I would argue that each of these intellectual technologies has embedded inside it what I'll call an intellectual ethic. And by that I simply mean that a technology, rather than being neutral, as we kind of want to believe, a technology has certain values embedded in it. And as we embrace those technologies, we also embrace those values. So in ethic, we'll say, this is the right way, or the best way to use your brain. And these other ways that the technology doesn't fit, those aren't so important anymore. So when we think about the latest technologies, in particular a smartphone and all the apps that run on the smartphone, I think what we need to do, and I fear we haven't done this, is to ask ourselves, what is the intellectual ethic of the smartphone? What kinds of thinking does it value? What kinds of thinking does it encourage us to engage in? And on the other hand, what types of thinking doesn't it support? And as a result, will tend to discourage us from engaging in it. And the reason this is so important is because I would argue that we've never had a media technology, or in fact any individual technology, that is so deeply entwined in our lives, our day-to-day, even moment-by-moment lives, as the smartphone has very quickly become. All you need to do, well, first, you don't even need to look at the research to know that. All you need to look at usually is your own behavior or the behavior of those around you. 10 years ago, if you saw everybody walking around staring at their palm as they walk down the sidewalk, you'd think it was pretty strange, but we've all become accustomed to that. Almost everyone who has a smartphone, and it's the vast majority of people today, carry it with them all the time, and often have it next to them even when they're sleeping. So we've never had this kind of interaction with a single technology before. And it's kind of hard to it's been hard for researchers to figure out exactly how much and how often we use our phones, because if you ask somebody, they'll underestimate it vast, and that's pretty well established. But in recent years, there have been some very precise studies that we can draw on. And this is, by the way, a picture of when the first smartphone, the iPhone, was introduced. That was in 2007. This is Steve Jobs of Apple Computer introducing it. And the reason I put this up here is because I think the marketing slogan Apple came up with has turned out to be incredibly prophetic, your life in your pocket. For many of us, I think that is kind of what the smartphone is. It's so tied up in everything we do that it really feels not only like something we're dependent on, but our entire life is somehow held within this little device that's in our pocket or in our hand all the time. So one of the studies, and this slide will probably look like visual gobbledygook to you, I know, but just bear with me. One of the best studies of how we use our smartphones was done about 5 years ago, I think in 2015, 4 years ago, in England at a school called the University of Lincoln. And what the researchers did was they put a piece of software onto about 25 student and faculty members and staff members' phones that actually tracked every time they used the phone, how long they used it, what they used it for. And they tracked people's activity for a 2-week period. And what they found is that the average person is actively using their phone about 5 hours a day, 5.05 to be precise. And this is completely in line with other recent research, which all points to the average time that a smartphone user is using the phone as 4 to 6 hours a day. That's an average, so it varies widely. Younger people tend to be quite a bit higher than that, older people somewhat less. And they also found that people use their phone, and by this they mean unlock it to do something with it, about 85 times a day. And again, that's an average, and it gets way, way higher for quite a few people. But what's particularly interesting is exactly how they're using it throughout the day, and that's what this chart shows. This chart is maps out, if you can put that back up, maps out one of the people who they studies, use of their phone over that 2-week period. So I don't know how well you can see this, but each of the vertical rows, starting from the bottom, is 1 day. Over on the left, it starts at midnight. In the middle is noon, and then midnight again on the right. And each of the little black horizontal lines is one use of the phone, and the width of that line is how long it was used. And what they found is the vast majority of uses of phones are very, very quick, 30 seconds or less. More than half are 30 seconds. And again, this isn't particularly surprising. The way people use their phones, particularly with social media, is to quickly glance and see a new message or a new notification or whatever. But it tends to be continuous throughout the day. So every single one of the people said that the first thing they do when they wake up is they look at their phone. One reason for that is that they're all using it as their alarm clock, so it's right there and you have to look at your phone. But all but one said that almost every day the last thing they do before they go to bed is also look at it. And then if you look what they're doing between those times, what you see is lots of little glances at the phone. And in fact, there are some like gaps during the day that showed up on these charts. And when the researchers looked into it, they found that often that was an indication that somebody was taking. So you can almost see, you can see the person's kind of entire life through one of these charts. So that again underscores this point that we've never really experienced a technology like that. A lot of people will say, well, we had TV, and that's absolutely right. And people watch TV a lot, and they still do. But if you think about traditional TV viewing, it tended to take place in isolated times during the day. So particularly in the evenings, which is why they called it prime time, people would turn on their TV and spend a lot of time watching TV. People weren't carrying their TV around in their pocket with them and taking it out every few seconds and looking at it. They didn't have a TV in front of them on their desk when they were at work or in front of them on their desk at school. And so this is a pattern of use that we've never seen before. And you can see in some of the other behavioral studies that when you look beyond just the patterns of how we use this, you can see that it changes our behavior very, very quickly. There's some amazing studies, surveys of teenagers in particular that show how their behavior with their phones has changed in a very, very short period. And so this comes from one of those studies. This was major, big surveys that asked teenagers about their use of their phones, or how often they're online, rather. And back in 2015, about a quarter, 24% of teenagers said that they were online almost constantly, and most of the others said several times a day. Just 3 years later, in 2018, that percentage that's on almost constantly had almost doubled. So about half of all teenagers say they're online almost constantly. Most of the rest say they're on several times a day, and only a small percentage now say they're rarely on. And if you go deeper than that, not only does it change people's behavior, but it's changing people's attitude, including attitudes about very kind of intimate parts of their lives. So here, this chart shows, again, a comparison of two surveys, again, of teenagers, one in 2012 and one in 2018, that asked them their preferred method for communicating with friends. In 2012, the percentage of teenagers who preferred face-to-face communication with friends, being with their friends actually in person, was already down to 49%. So half teenagers said that they like to be with their friends in person, but half were already saying they preferred to communicate through electronic media of one sort or another. By 2018, just 6 years later, you can see with the drop of that first line, the number who preferred in-person conversation over other things had dropped to just 32%. So only 1/3 of teenagers now actually prefer getting together in person with their friends. The others prefer to use their phones or other computers to converse. This is really, I think this is really kind of startling. Without making any value judgment about it, it's just this radical change, not only
in how we converse with our friends, but our attitudes toward what friendship even is. If most people now think it's better to converse through a technology than in person, that tells us that our idea of friendship, this very intimate part of our lives, is being changed by the technology. So what I would suggest is that we really need to step back because there's no sign of us slowing down our use of phones and social media. We need to step back and say, what does it mean? What happens to us when we allow this one single tool, a tool, by the way, that's being programmed and designed by corporations who have an interest in holding our attention and grabbing our attention. What happens to us when we give it such power over our cognition, our perception, and our communication? So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes looking through what I consider kind of the best recent studies that have looked at this question to see what we can learn. The first study is one that was actually done quite a while ago, and I talk about it in my book, The Shallows. It was done in 2009, one of the first really rigorous studies of how digital technology use influences thinking. The researchers were at Stanford University in California, and they got a large number of people to participate in the study, and they divided them into two different groups based on how often they used their computers online, used the internet. And so the people who spent a lot of time online, they called heavy multitaskers. And the other group of people who spent much less time online, they called them light multitaskers. And then they gave them a set of 6 basic tests of cognition, how well they think. And on all 6 of those tests, the heavy multitaskers did significantly worse than the light multitaskers. And I think one of the most interesting of the 6 experiments was the one that's illustrated here. It was a test to decipher how capable people are of distinguishing important information from trivial information. And if you step back and consider that for a moment, you realize that that's really the first stepping stone of thinking deeply. Yet first you have to figure out what's worth thinking. And what this experiment showed, and it's illustrated by this chart, is that when there are distractions coming at people, heavy multitaskers, and this is the darker line going down toward the right, as the distractions increase, heavy multitaskers begin to have a lot more trouble than light multitaskers in determining what's important, what they should be focused on. And they begin to be distracted by the information rather than being able to control their mind. As the researchers said when they wrote an article about this, they become suckers for irrelevance. And what they theorized is going on here is that what happens when we adapt ourselves to this technology of distraction that's bombarding us with different messages and different stimuli all the time, is instead of focusing on the important stuff, we begin to simply focus on what's new. Whatever the newest thing coming through our phone or through our computer screen is, that's what grabs our attention. And that begins to push away even any kind of consideration of what should I be thinking about, what's worth thinking. It's just what's new that grabs your attention. Another of the tests that they looked at, which I'll just mention in passing, they actually did a test of people's multitasking, how well they shifted between different tasks. And here the researchers thought, well, at least here the heavy multitaskers are going to do better. I mean, they're doing it all the time. They're practicing it all the time. And they found even here, heavy multitaskers did worse. They were worse at multitasking than light multitasking. If you ask them, however, they'll always say, oh, I'm great at this. I've grown up doing this.
if they're a younger person, they might say, oh, I can do social, I can do Snapchat and Instagram while I'm doing my homework and stuff, and also do all sorts of this other stuff. But they're kind of tricking themselves, because what they're good at is shifting their attention very, very quickly from one thing to another. But what they're bad at is actually maintaining their focus in a way that allows them to efficiently get one thing done. So when you look at these studies, people say they're really good at it, but actually they'd perform much better if they actually focused on one thing at a time. What they've really optimized in themselves is their ability to be distracted. Now, let me back up, set up this next one. So as I said, this was a study done in 2009, before smartphones took over. This study was all done on laptops, desktops. That's how people were going online. Since then, of course, now we have smartphones, so that same kind of distractedness that we used to have to wait to open our laptop to get is with us all the time. Our phones are always connected. They're always with us. We're pulling them out all the time. So there have been a lot of studies. There were a lot of studies done very, very quickly that replicated these results that I've talked about with smartphones. As you'd expect, if multitasking and being distracted interrupts your train of thought in a way that reduces your performance on some important cognitive task, as you'd expect, the same thing would happen with smartphones, maybe even a little worse, and that seems to be true. So there's a lot of studies that confirm that happens. We're distracted by our phones and makes us harder to concentrate. But then there was another round of studies, this 5 or 6 years ago, that said, okay, but smartphones, it's not just when we've unlocked them and are using them for something. They're notifying us. They're buzzing and beeping and saying we have somebody we know put up a new Instagram picture or whatever. They're doing this all the time, dozens of times a day. The average person, their phone pings them or buzzes or something, vibrates. And so then we got a round of studies that looked at what happens when you don't use your phone, but you hear it ring or buzz or something, and very, very similar effects. Just knowing that there's some new information on your phone distracts you and pulls your mind away, and you see the same kind of problem thinking deeply. And also, people have done studies that what happens to us physically when our phone alerts us to something, but we don't check. Well, your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate increases, and you feel anxiety. You feel nervous because we so want that information. Human beings are information gatherers by nature, and so when we know there's new information out there, particularly if it's related to it socially, we crave getting that information. So separate us from that, and our body reacts very strongly. So that's where things stood until a couple of years ago, when a professor at cognitive psychologist at the University of Texas, a guy named Adrian Ward, had a further idea, which was if the phones are with us all the time, they seem to intrude on our thinking when we use them, they seem to intrude on our thinking when they're alerting us or notifying us. What happens if they're just there but they're turned off? Would that have an effect on our thinking as well? So he and some colleagues went out and did this very ingenious experiment to test that hypothesis. They got 500 people, undergraduate students, and they gave them 2 basic tests of brain function, their ability to think. One test was a test of what's called working memory capacity. Your working memory is essentially the contents of your conscious mind, so it's what your brain is working with at any given moment. And working memory capacity is essentially a measure of how much of your brain power you can focus on a particular task, particularly a task that's mentally challenging. And then the other test was a test of what's called fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is our ability to make sense of a situation or a problem we've never seen before and figure out how to solve. Very, very important aspect of human intelligence. In fact, both of these tests, both of these measures are essentially measures of our intellect, how smart we're able to be in any given situation. So they have 500 people, they give them these two tests, and the only difference among the people was where their phone was when they took the test. So 1/3 of the group had their phones in front of them on the desk when they did the test, face down, so the screen was down and turned off, and they knew it was turned off, so they knew it wasn't going to beep or buzz or anything. Another third had their phone either in their pocket or in their handbag or in their backpack with them in the room, but out of sight. And then the other third had to put their phone in a different room entirely. These two charts show how those three groups did on each of these tests. The working memory test on the left, fluid intelligence is on the right. The first bar in each one is the people who had their phone in view on their desk, the next one in their pocket, and the next in the other room. And so what you see here is that the people who had their phone in view, turned off again, in front of them did the work significantly more poorly on both of these tests of intelligence than did the other people. The people who did best were the people whose phone was in a different room. The people who had their phone with them but out of sight did somewhere in the middle. So it's almost as if the closer your phone gets to you, the more of your brain power kind of sucks out of your head, which seems very strange when you think about it. But at the same time that this experiment was going on, there were some other very similar ones done completely differently without knowledge of the other, but showed a very similar effect. One was an experiment done at the University of Arkansas that was really a test of people's college students' ability to learn, in this case in a large lecture class. I think there were 150 students. And here too, they had they put the students into three different groups. One kept the phone outside of the classroom. The other two groups had their phones with them, but one part of those people actually used the phone, and the other had their phone with them but didn't use it. And then after a lecture, and it was on a difficult, complex subject, they wanted these people to really have to think hard to see what the effect would be. All the students were given an exam, again a difficult exam, to discern their retention of the material and their ability to make sense of the lecture. And what they saw was the students who had their phones in a different room, not with them in the classroom, scored a whole letter grade higher on that test than did the other two groups. And what's particularly interesting about the other two groups is that they scored equally poorly, whether they used the phone or whether their phone was just with them, but they weren't using it. So again, another indication that something strange here is going on when our phones are just close to us. And then there was a third experiment, looked at something very different, which is how people rated the depth of the conversations they have in person with another person. And how empathetic did they think the other person was, how honest, how kind of rich the conversation was. And here too, again, the only difference was that some people had these conversations with their phones with them in the room, and other people had to have their phones in a different room. And here too, we see a big effect. The people who didn't have their phones with them when they're having a face-to-face conversation with another person rated that conversation much more highly on relationship quality, on their trust in the other person, and on their sense of empathy, understanding from the other person, compared to people who had their phones with them. So what's going on? As I say, it seems very strange that a phone, even turned off, a tool, an inanimate object, can have such a deep effect on us. but actually it fits very well with what psychologists know about the way our minds work. Our brains aren't just thinking apparatuses, things we think with. They're also monitoring apparatuses. A very important part of what our brains do is keep track of what's going on around us. And you can understand that this is very important. It was particularly important a long, long time ago when being able to see a predator creeping up on you or being able to see a source of food could determine whether you lived or died. So our brains are very, very finely tuned, monitoring everything that's around us. And what psychologists have learned is that different objects in our environment have different levels of what they call salience, importance to us. And the higher the salience an object has, the more of our brain power we devote to monitoring that, making sure it doesn't change, doesn't move somewhere. And we're basically unconscious of this aspect of our brain's work, but it's very important because a lot of our brain power goes toward this monitoring task. So if there's lots of things around you, or one thing around you with a high degree of salience, you won't have as much brain power to apply to a difficult problem you're working out, a difficult challenge you're having. So think about what we've created with a smartphone. A smartphone, as Adrian Ward, that University of Texas professor says, has supernormal salience. We've never seen anything in the world that has such a pull on our mind. And why is that so? Well, think about what your smartphone represents to you. Your smartphone is your mailbox, where you're getting email and other messages all the time, including from people who are very important to you. It's your photo album. All the pictures of the events and people you know in your life are all there on your phone. Your television, more and more people use their phones to watch TV, whether it's Netflix or YouTube or whatever. It's your bank, where your information about money is, and oftentimes what you use to pay for things. It's your library. Whenever you want to do research, whenever you want to find information, you go to Google or something and you look it up. It's your radio, where all your music is. It's your newspaper, where you get your news. It's your shopping mall, when you want to buy something. Sometimes it's even your telephone. Curiously, that's like the least used function now in our phones is telephone, but it's there if you want to. And most important of all, your phone is everyone you know. So imagine a party going on around the clock where all your friends are and they're all talking to each other. That's also what your phone is. So your phone represents all of those things. And as a result, has this draw on your attention, even if it's turned off, because it simply, you know that all of that stuff is in there. And that stuff's important to you and is a diversion, is entertaining, has informational value, social value. So you can't just turn off your brain's concentration or what Adrian Ward calls the brain drain of the smartphone. It's always there, and the closer it is to you, because it's more prominent, the bigger draw that has. Well, why does this matter? Who cares? You know, we're adapting to it. We have no problem adapting to our phone. People walk around with it all day. Only rarely do we, cause accidents or stuff. But by and large, we very, very quickly, this all happened in 10 years, we very, very quickly integrated this powerful technology, very meaningful technology, into our day-to-day lives. We've basically become accustomed to carrying it with us all the time, constantly interacting with it. So maybe this is just another example of the human mind adapting to a new technology, as we did with the map, as we did with the clock, as we did with all sorts of others. I think there's a lot of truth to that way of looking at it. There's no question that we are adapting very rapidly to this technology. But I think we shouldn't do this without a clear understanding of what we lose as we go through this process. Because what I would argue is that our mind's ability to have the deepest, most interesting thoughts and the deepest, most interesting conversations, the deepest, most interesting ideas, all hinges on our ability not to gather information all the time and bombarded with messages, but our capability of screening out those interruptions and distractions and really focusing our attention. That's the only time when we really think critically, conceptually, and even in some ways creatively. One way to think about this is to look at how knowledge and deep thinking emerges in the human mind. And this is a very complicated subject, and we don't know by any means all of how that goes on in our brains. But we do know of the importance of two very different forms of memory. One is the one I was talking about before called working memory. This is a very short-term store. It's where you're holding the information in your conscious mind that you're thinking about at any given moment. And what we know about working memory is it has a really small capacity. It can't hold very much. Back in the 1950s, neuroscientists thought that you could hold about 7 elements of information in your conscious mind at any given time. Now they've reduced that number. Now the common thinking is you can hold about 2 to 4 pieces of elements of information in your working memory at any given moment. And then there's the memory that we think of as memory, long-term memory. And that's all the memories of people we know, events or experiences we've had, facts we've learned, and so forth. And unlike working memory, which has this very small capacity, long-term memory has vast capacity. Nobody's ever, to the best of our knowledge, nobody's ever filled it up. Nobody's ever said, oh, that's it, can't remember anything anymore. My memory is full. So if working memory is kind of a thimble-sized store of information, talking about this with getting distracted here, but I was talking about this with a group of high school students a couple of months ago, and I got to the thimble thing, and I was looking out, and I said, I don't think these people know what a thimble is. So a thimble is very small. If you don't know what a thimble is, it's very small. So if working memory is a thimble-sized store of information, long-term memory is more like a bathtub. It's really big. And it turns out what's crucial to our abilities, our mind's ability to think deep thoughts, is our ability to carry information that's coming into our working memory, carry it in this over to this bathtub-sized container of long-term memory and put it there. This is a process called memory consolidation. And the reason it's so important isn't that then we know that fact or that experience in the future. That is important, but that's not the essence of why it's important. It's through this process of memory consolidation, storing a short-term memory over in long-term memory, that we connect that information or that experience or that emotion with everything else we know, with everything else that's in our brain. And it turns out that knowledge is not little bits of information, the stuff you Google up on Google. Knowledge lies in those connections or associations that our mind makes with all these different things we know and learn. And what we know further about this process of memory consolidation is it all hinges on attention. If you're able to pay attention to something, then you're able to move it over to long-term memory much more successfully, and you have a much richer set of associations and connections, and hence a much richer set of knowledge in your own mind. And what we've done with digital technology, and particularly with our smartphones and with our social media, is we've created this tool that is constantly disrupting our attention. Think of all this information that's pouring into our minds, into our working memory, from our phones, from other sources of information. Well, if working memory has a very small capacity, then in order to take in a new piece, you have to get rid of something that's already in there. And this has become something that is going on at a high speed throughout the day. So we're never storing information long enough or paying attention to it long enough, including important information, to create rich long-term memories that in turn are the basis for deep knowledge, deep thinking. So as we push further and further into this process of adapting to this new technology and this new environment that encourages this kind of fast-paced, disrupted, distracted thinking, we are stealing from ourselves, in essence, our brain's power to tap into its deepest, most profound capability. Stuff that you not only need to do well in school or in work, but also is the basis for having a rich and interesting mental life, for thinking interesting thoughts throughout your life from when you're young to when you're old. This, I think, is what we sacrifice in return for the great variety of diversions and conveniences that the technology provides. Encapsulated, if I was going to encapsulate it in an image, I would use this image of the French sculptor Rodin's famous sculpture, which is called The Thinker. It used to be, until recently, whenever anybody wanted to kind of have an image to get across, oh, this is somebody thinking deeply, they'd always pull out Rodin's The Thinker, this guy who's got his chin on his fist, obviously deep in some very attentive, very concentrated thought. We don't know what the thinker is thinking about, probably not composing it. In this, I think, what was until recently this image of the highest forms of available to us, I think there's a reason that we don't see this image very much anymore, and that is because not only are we engaging in this kind of thinking less and less, this very attentive thinking, but we're kind of saying maybe this isn't so important. So not only are we changing the way we think, thanks to the technology, but we're changing the way we think about thinking as well. Let me end with a quote from the late American novelist David Foster Wallace, who gave a commencement address at a college back in 2005, Kenyon College, which was all about our ability to control our attention. Essentially, what he argued is that the great struggle all of us face, particularly today, constant distraction and so forth, is the ability to maintain our own personal control over our mind. And by that he means our ability to choose what we pay attention to. And as he put it, learning how to think means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to, and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. What I fear is happening now as we all turn to our phones and other screens to gather information is we're not only gathering information, but we're looking the phone to the technology to tell us what to pay attention to. Rather than saying this is important, this is what I need to concentrate on now, we're just concentrating on whatever is coming through our phone. Which means basically we're ceding control of our mind, not only to the technology, but to the companies behind the technology who have a very big commercial interest in grabbing control of our attention, taking control of what we pay attention to. And it does seem to me that if this is the trade-off for all these conveniences we get with technology, that we lose our very ability to maintain control about what we think about moment to moment through our lives. This may, in fact, not be a trade Thank you for your attention. Yep. I know, I have my phone with me too. Think of how good it would have been if I didn't have my phone in my pocket. Hi. Yeah. Yeah. To my knowledge, it hasn't been done yet. It's a very good question because when Apple Watch and smartwatches came out, one of the ways they were promoted was, oh, this will reduce your dependence on your phone because you won't have to pull out your phone all the time. There's another way of thinking about it that it actually makes everything worse because you're always, everything that the phone represents, suddenly this thing on your wrist represents. So the research hasn't been done yet. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. Great question. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I would think that you're right, that one thing we've seen is the ability for somebody to sustain their interest in anything, including charitable causes or whatever, seems to go down with all of this distraction. On the other hand, people point out that one thing that this communication device is good for, it's getting people aware of different causes that they might participate in. So I think there's a tension between, the positive benefits of using the tool to encourage people to think about others and get involved in different causes, and the fact that the phone seems to create this way of thinking that makes it harder and harder for people to sustain their interest in one thing, because when the next message comes in, then they shift over to that. Probably, yeah.
You were describing in Shallows about memory consolidation as being mediated by hippocampus and having a lot to do with emotional engagement. Our phones are designed for that kind of engagement, but it doesn't seem like our usage of the phone is enhancing our ability to remember anything. Is it possible that our constant usage of a device that's made to be highly engaging is not only impoverishing our intellectual capacity, but also our emotional?
It's certainly possible, and and I want to be careful because I don't want to overstate the evidence, but there's a growing number of studies that seem to indicate that, at least when it comes to empathy, we're seeing reductions in empathy and people's ability to richly understand what other people are going through, what they're feeling. And one theory about that is that emotions take different amounts of time to emerge in our mind, in our nervous system. Very primitive kinds of emotions, fear, hatred, these things, they're instantaneous. But the more subtle emotions, like empathy, actually require time to develop in the mind. And the theory is that this constant distraction gets in the way of that as well. So we're not giving our richest emotions time to emerge. And so I think it's definitely a concern. I don't think there's enough evidence right now to be sure about that, but what we have so far seems to indicate that there might be a reduction in certain emotional attachment. Well,
Hi there. Opinion question for you. So obviously, we are still attached to a device. Eventually, when we start rise of augmented reality and virtual becoming more mainstream, how does that affect our level of distraction? We're seeing that with Google Maps now using augmented reality. I'm seeing a lot of people now have no idea what direction they're going or how they're, where they're going. So how do we take your knowledge and look ahead at the future when we start seeing even more distraction with things like augmented?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think one thing we haven't been very good at doing is thinking carefully about how we design these things, when they're active, when they're not. The dominant kind of Silicon Valley design mode is simply more and faster. And so whenever you can activate any kind of information display, you want it activated all the time. And I think what we know, not only from the stuff I've talked about here, but when you look at, say, pilots who are using pop-up displays, fighter pilots and others, that has to be done very, very carefully, because that in and of itself becomes this big distraction, and you can actually defeat the purpose of it if you design it poorly. And so we need, and whether and how this gets done, but we should be thinking much, much more carefully about how these design decisions influence attentiveness, influence our ability to learn, things that are very important to us. And until we do that, I think we'll default to this more is better mode. And then only after we begin to see problems will we say, oh my gosh, we went down the wrong path, and then it becomes hard to back up.
Good evening. So I've taught your essay for a number of years, and I'm at the Oviedo campus, and our student body skews quite young. And while I'm sorry to say that after most of my classes you come off as alarmist, it's always a spirited discussion. I've always enjoyed, bringing up the points you make in your Google article. But I pair it with segments of a debate you had with is smart technology making us dumb? And I play the part where you talk about skimming, where smart technology, you believe, makes skimming default. And one of the points you brought up here tonight was the fact that newness is overriding importance. And when I pause the video and engage with my students, I always ask, and I'm glad I get to ask you right now, are those mutually exclusive? That at one point, isn't everything that is important relatively also new, as though there's distinction? So I just wanted to ask you that in person.
Well, yeah, I mean, by definition, it has to be.
At one point, everything is new.
Everything's new, but there's still, part of the decision that the mind makes about what to pay attention to involves scanning, involves getting a quick. We can be good at this or not so good at this, but it's also a very important skill. The skimming and scanning, getting a quick read on what's important or not, is also a very, very important skill. Mm-hmm. I think what we're seeing based on the evidence is that we're not doing that very well.
Okay,
so yeah,
quality of skimming.
The ability to use skimming as a means for saying what's important here.
Yes.
Instead, skimming becomes just skimming. That
for
it
its own
doesn't,
sake.
skimming for its own sake because
Okay.
you want to process the new stuff,
Ah,
and there's no, you don't progress to saying, okay, this is important, so let's slow down here.
so the slowing is, in your mind, would enable the understanding of importance. I'm getting that right.
The slowing down is once you've begun to figure out what's important,
What's important.
then you begin to screen out distractions and say, this really requires attention, rather than saying, okay, what's next?
What's next? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
There are corporations you mentioned, the social media applications. Since we're so influenced by this machine, is there a possibility that the people that lead those corporations could sway a close election?
Well, we've kind of experimented with that as well. I think yes. I think definitely. You know what? Because these companies, you know, make their money by analyzing this data very, very carefully to see, you know, what people are likely to do in the future, then it becomes much easier to target those people, not only for marketing messages, but for political messages. And so one thing we see Facebook being used for, and by being used for, is highly targeting not only the people who are likely to support the candidate you want to promote, but targeting people who support the other candidate, and then figuring out precisely which message to send them at which time that will reduce their likelihood of vote. And we've seen, I mean, this goes on all the time on social media, and Facebook, you know, has embedded consultants in different political campaigns who help the campaigns to figure out this data and figure out messages, what messages to supply when. So we've created this influence machine that, you know, isn't unprecedented in that marketers and political strategists have always tried to do this, influence us, that's what they do. But we've never had one that can be so precise in figuring out what message to deliver at what moment to create a different behavior. So you can certainly see how in a very close election, and there's debates, you know, there's genuine debates, for instance, if you look at the 2016 presidential election, as to whether, for instance, the Russians' Facebook campaigns and Twitter campaigns, you know, swayed enough votes to change the outcome, and people have different opinions. But you could certainly lay out a scenario where it would make.
Mr. Carr, I appreciate that you've been a strident critic of technology with all your writings. I think the audience would benefit if you could touch on memory offload, that concept of memory offload, and the patience deficit that you wrote about as well. My question involves today being the 24th anniversary of the 1995 publication of Industrial Society and Its Future, where Kaczynski develops a deeper critique of technology in and of itself, and the problems that you're dealing with cell phones and artificial intelligence and automation replacing laborers and all. These are recent problems, and a lot of reformers put forth notions of laws or various ways that we can slow down or regulate these particular technologies as they arise. But the deeper problem of technology itself, as Kaczynski points out, is that primitive man that we've been for most of our species' lifetime is not subject to the whims of small groups or market forces or egomaniac or ruthless leaders who have an ultimate power, and all these small groups that rule over us with no accountability to us. And I'm just kind of wondering where you stand. Would you push some kind of implausible reform that some law could come up and obviously it could be changed down the line, but it might restrict technology? I mean, is there really any kind of viable solution to the problems caused by technology without complete eradication of technology itself?
Well, as you can imagine, it's a difficult question. And I mean, I've struggled with this question of, what's the solution? Because in some ways, I think, coming up, it would be nice if I could offer a solution, a little recipe that we could follow to make what I see as problems, some people don't see them as problems, kind of go away. But to me, that's almost, first of all, I don't see those kind of simple solutions. And second, this desire to reduce every problem to a set of explicit solution steps that you can take seems to me, in some ways, a manifestation of the kind of superficial thinking that I'm arguing we've already fallen too much of a victim to, which is a way, I guess, that I'm sidestepping your question. But no, I think I don't know if there is a solution to the way technology has been moving for far longer than the time period I've talked about. And it becomes very, very tricky when we get into what kinds of laws or governmental regulations would be appropriate. Because you very quickly get to the fact that what these technologies are supplying is information. So yeah, I think it's bad that a few corporate entities have such control over the flow of information, but I'm a little bit nervous of turning that control over to the government, because it's also dangerous for the government to have too much control over the information we see. So to me, I mean, I think there are some regulations that can be done regarding privacy, regarding how data gets collected and how it gets used about people and so forth. That would be very useful. Maybe also, some more antitrust type thinking, updating our thinking about monopolies and stuff. But ultimately, I think dealing with this issue has to come from people changing their attitude, a shift in our cultural view of technology, and also beyond that, a cultural view of what's important in our lives and in the way we think. And if that doesn't change, I really don't think that, I doubt that the big trends are going to go in a different. Hi.
Mr. Carr, I did take a look at that Atlantic article the other fellow, Michael, was talking about, or I'd like to ask you about that, but I only scanned it. I have a fair number of students here, and they're actually still here. God bless them. They were enticed by the holy grail of extra credit. And I was hoping they could hear what you had to say, and that at some point you have an opportunity to speak directly to them. They have evolved in a particular way. They're younger. This is the mantle we've handed them. There is kind of a shiny object mentality. If you could just give them, college, one or two pieces of advice about how to handle this and what changes to make, what advice would it be?
I would say the most simplest and most important piece of advice I could give, and also the hardest to do, would be not to carry your phone with you all. Spend some part of the day where you deliberately say, look, I don't want to be distracted. I don't want to check I don't want to scroll through Instagram or whatever. And every day have some period of where you don't have your phone with you. And doesn't really matter to me what you're doing, whether you're in class or taking a walk or going out to a meal with your friends or whatever. Because I think one thing that comes really clearly through the research that I've been talking about is that the effects get stronger and stronger the more dependent we are on the technology. And that is very much wrapped into how close it is to us all the time. We kind of, when the iPhone and other smartphones came out, we immediately said, this is something I have to carry with me all day long. I have to have it next to me in bed, or maybe under my pillow, and then I have to carry it with me all the time, and then I have to look at it before I go to bed. It seems to me breaking that habit, and I'm not saying getting rid of your phone, but just giving your mind time to do things without that brain drain, without your phone tapping on your shoulder, would be the best thing you could do.
We have 3 more questions.
3? Okay.
Good evening. I feel like I'm in my but I'm stuck in the middle. Is benefit because with the phone, it's such an innovation because I get to communicate with friends from Chile, very far country. It's also very beneficial because for school, it helps me when I don't have a laptop 4G and I could just. But I feel like you're wrong in the sense that it doesn't make it makes us lazier because we have this mindset make everything. So we invent car. Try to make. Question to you is, do you think that we should dim down the amount of with our make us lazier, or is it just that we have to that it just affects our lives?
No, I think it's more the former, that you can make a real difference by at least questioning your relationship to your phone and your dependence on your phone, and then maybe changing that relationship. You're absolutely right that we can sit here for the next 2 hours and list all the benefits we get from our phones and from social media and from messaging systems and from the internet and from Google, and they'd also all be absolutely correct. I mean, one of the reasons we have our phones with us all the time and we use them all the time is because we like them. They give us value. They give us ways to connect with different people. So the good and the bad are very tightly aligned here. I guess one way to look at this, though, is that from the very start, from the origins of the internet and moving on through phones, we've been encouraged to think about thinking as a matter of information gathering. So the more information available to us, the more messages available to us, and the quicker we can get them, that all has to be good, because more information is better. I think what we're learning is that there's the amount of information available to us that's very important, but there's also how that information is presented to us or distributed to us, which is actually even more important because it affects the way we make sense of or don't make sense of the information and connect it to other things and put it into context. To me, there are ways to think carefully about what are the benefits here, what are the problems, and how can we begin to change our behavior and our use of this to get the benefits, to get most of the benefits, but reduce the amount of problems we have. But having said that, I have to say that it's really, really hard for people to do that because they're so in love with their phone that even if they say, "Oh, I'm going to get off," I'm not going to use my phone now, or I'm going to get off of Snapchat or Instagram. you see that lasting for a couple of days, and then they go back to their old habit. And so, you know, I think there are ways, behavioral ways, to start to deal with this, but it's hard.
So much for coming. I had a great time listening to it. I was really excited.
Oh, thank you.
You. I learned a lot. And my question, you mentioned some of the studies that they found that people, their smartphone, they would feel like their heart they would feel some kind of anxiety, and automatically made me think of some kind of addiction. You away from it, feel like you need it. And then it started making me think of my favorite show, Black Mirror. They have an awesome show. There's this one episode, actually this season, called Smithereen. And it talked a lot about addiction to social media. And I started, making the argument, if maybe it's not the device that's the problem. Maybe it's the companies that use this device to make us addicted to it. Because Facebook, Facebook has been using algorithm to make us want to come back. You know, triggering our happy brain, or like the part of our brain that makes us happy, making us want to come back. So, what would it look like if that was gone? What would this device look like if that stimulus, those stimuli were gone? So, question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think you're absolutely right to point back these companies, and you know, in one sense, it's what media companies have always wanted to do, which is get you to look at their stuff. But we've never seen the power that we see with Facebooks and Googles and Twitters to actually understand at a very, very precise level exactly what encourages compulsive consumption of information. Whether you call it an addiction or not, kind of is a semantic problem. Certainly, I think using the word addiction in kind of the common sense way that this is something we want to do all the time, yeah, it's definitely addictive. There's no doubt about it. You just have to see how people use the phone and social media. Whether you can, so I think, you know, absolutely we need to look at how this tool becomes a delivery device for these very compelling messages that are very carefully designed by behavioral scientists and all sorts of people employed by these companies. Can we imagine somehow separating those uses of the phone from the phone itself? Theoretically, maybe, but I think they're very much intertwined. I think the technologies, the software and the hardware have been designed and developed in tandem. So it's very hard for me to see a smartphone, for instance, being hugely popular if you got rid of what people mainly use it. But I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about that and try to get companies to at least be able, so that we can at least see what, we should at least be able to see exactly what they're doing and the effect it has on us. They know this, so we should. Well, one more?
Last question, and then we'll have a short announcement.
Okay.
They said last.
It's got to be good.
Answered the second one, maybe during the book signing, yeah. So since we're at a college, I'm going to act on that. It's a college. At Seminole State College, we use white noise in our library and tutoring center. I don't know if anyone has walked in there and they hear this hum and they can focus more. That's white noise. They're also used in airplanes during business hours at some workplaces and to help people get to sleep, but we use it mainly to focus and complete silence, awkward silence environment. So in your opinion, do you believe that society has become so used to a smartphone high that we cannot go back to a larger percentage of the population enjoying natural silence or focus in a natural sounding environment?
It's a very interesting question. I don't know. I wouldn't, because I haven't thought about the question of different kinds of silence or artificial. I don't feel comfortable kind of offering an opinion. I do think, though, that we are becoming less and less able to exist without stimulus, new stimulus at us. And that can be, that's related to the question you're talking about. But if you think about, and this particularly true of young children, if you think about how children and the rest of us as well used to navigate the day, there'd be times when your friends were around, you're at school or whatever, and there's lots of socializing going on. And so there's this peak of like activity and talking and conversation and playing, and that's all great. And then there are times you'd go home, and suddenly there wouldn't be people around you anymore. And at first you'd say, oh, Mom, I'm bored. And then that experience would force you to be alone with your thoughts. It would force you to figure out how to amuse yourself. Might open up, you might discover that, hey, I like doing this or something, because you're forced to deal with a lack of social stimulus. You're forced to deal with a quieter environment, and you have to take control of it. That's gone. Once you have a phone, you're socializing all the time. Because your friends are always there, people around you are always there. And I find that a really scary phenomenon, that from a very young age, because kids are getting phones and other digital gadgets at an ever younger age, we're taking away the opportunity to experience an environment without a lot of stimuli that requires us to develop certain skills, certain mental skills, social skills that are very different from the skills you gain when you're in a very active environment. So I do think that manifests itself in people no longer being even able to kind of allow their environment to quiet down. As soon as that happens, you grab your phone. And whether we can change that, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Thank you again for your thought-provoking words and having us think about our relationship with our phones, and now thinking about how do we divorce them, right? My working memory is telling me that I have 3 things I need to tell you. So if you are interested in purchasing his book, they are available over here at our bookstore by the balloons. You can purchase the book. We also have a book signing reception where Mr. Carr will be available in the room over here to your right, where he can sign the book. And I know that some of you had a lot of questions, and I'm sorry we had to scare you away and make you go back to your seats, but you are able to speak with him briefly over there as well. And then the last thing is that we do have some yummy food for you. So we have a wonderful reception, so I hope that you can stay a little longer and join us for all of this. And thank you so much for taking time this evening to join us.
There'll be a phone burning in the parking lot later tonight.
Created